So, yesterday, just a quick recap. We left off with the Roaring Twenties, which was a really uh, good time in the U.S. and in certain places around the world. In the wake of World War I, that came to an end in 1918, things had been on the up for the U.S. Women were enjoying had worked hard to win the right to vote, and that was came along in the 19th Amendment in 1920, and culturally they were more enjoying the rights that men had always enjoyed and starting to sort of express those freedoms in ways that men had always been accustomed to, driving cars and dancing and going out and drinking, or doing whatever and being visible in the world, much so than they had been in the past. And also it was kind of an odd time because you had all this kind of progress. You had these cultural movements in music and film and all this going on. At the same time, it was this conservative era where we lived under prohibition, where the sale of alcohol had been banned, and that was going to continue into the 1930s. And we talked about how that's created problems, but there was a lot of economic growth, which is going to, in the end, cause a problem as we get to the Great Depression. So the thing about economic downturns, everybody wants to blame somebody. And even with the Great Depression, it is something that is still widely studied, and there are varying opinions on what caused it. What was the main events that were most important. The response to that, was it appropriate? Was it too far? Was it not far enough? It's still very relevant in today's world. And there are varying opinions on what actually caused it, there's really about two major sort of theories behind it, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. But the other thing too is, where do you place blame? And that's a lot of what we like to do in today's world, is when things get bad and we tend to look at the president. No matter who the president is, we like to point fingers at that man, as it's been a man so far, and say, this is your fault, this is your responsibility. The problem with that, particularly when you think of things like what's happening today, or the Great Depression, is that it's a global problem. It is a global depression, and it was the worst of its day. Well, I mean, there's nothing that has compared to the Great Depression. It was the worst economic downturn in the industrialized world to date. And it reached nearly every country in some form. So when it's global, it's hard to point fingers at one individual and say, this is your fault. And these types of economic downturns are really complicated. But we'll kind of talk about some of the things that happened that led to it, and more so the impact of the effect of the Great Depression on people. Which is probably the most important element. So as I mentioned, the 20s were sort of a great economic expansion for the U.S. A lot was going on, and there was a lot of trust put into the stock market, which many believed it was just going to keep growing and growing. And speculation was just going to, keep making people rich. And a lot of people did get rich on the stock market in the 20s, but there was a few sort of economic hiccups and a little concern prior to October 29th, where we actually had the stock market crash. But there was some concern before that day that, okay, well, maybe, we might be headed towards some type of economic issue here. And there was some panic. And then the stock market crashes on October 29th, 1929. And as I said, it's the start of the Great Depression, and it's not necessarily the cause. That is one view, that stock market crash was the cause of the Great Depression, but it's, again, pretty complicated, and a lot of people will say, no, it was a symptom of that. But we sort of mark the start of the Great Depression at that day and at that time. And what happens for several years after that is just this tumbling economy. So, for example, over the course of 2 months, that stock market crash, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which I'm sure if you ever listen to the news, particularly financial news, doesn't matter. It comes up when people talk about the stock market and economics. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average is this index of companies. Today, that index is 30 companies, and it sort of spans the industries in the U.S., the most prominent industries in the U.S. So there's some pharmaceutical companies like Merck and Johnson & Johnson. There's clothing companies like Nike. There's Boeing is on there. So it's always really big companies, but it spans, a large sort of, try to sort of capture, the industry within the country. Walmart is as retailers on there. And I think there was far fewer than 30 companies on the Dow Jones price index average in 1929, but you could also imagine they were a lot different companies. There was a sugar company, there was a rubber company, there was a steel company, a lot more of those raw materials being made into, building products and stuff like that. There was a petroleum company, things like that. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average was, I think, 380 points the day of Black Tuesday. And over the course of the 2 months, it fell to about half. It went down to about 190 points, which at that time was crazy, right? It lost half its growth over 2 months. Today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is over 30,000 points, and it drops more than what the total amount of the Dow Jones Industrial Average was in 1929. So that created a real panic. So what happens then is just a loss of confidence in the economy across the board. So these people that are have the sort of wealth that are able to invest and make money in the stock market are looking at other areas of the economy, and they're worrying about that. They're worried about an economic slowdown. Now, today, one of the big economic issues is inflation, right? We, feel that when we go to the gas station, or we go to buy groceries, or, hopefully you don't need to buy a car right now, or a home. We see the prices, and we hear about that again all the time. And again, we hear, people getting blamed for that. It's really costing a lot, and it's hurting people. And that was, a lot of that was driven by demand, right? So there was demand for cars. We had a shortage of computer chips. And that was, driving up prices for cars because it had slowed down production. Oil had slowed down in production during COVID because we weren't using as much gas. And I'm sure if you guys were around, you remember with the Kroger discount in March or April of 2020 in Athens, Ohio, I paid about 50 cents per gallon for my gas. I think it's about 60 maybe, but that's, you know, with my big chunky discount from buying groceries and everything. But so, you know, it had fallen because, and then production drops to keep, you know, to lower the supply because there's not as much demand. And then it takes a long time to ratchet that back up when we get to, you know, like full scale employment and things like that going on, and everybody's sort of back to their normal lives. Same thing with cars, you know, same thing with housing. And there's a pretty good cash supply with a lot of people now that are buying homes with cash, and companies are buying up homes to rent and things like that, which drives up the housing market. The problem, though, is that deflation is also not necessarily a good thing. Now, inflation, what we're seeing right now, no, that's not good. But in a healthy economy, we do expect a little bit of inflation. Now, in a healthy economy that's, you know, just, we know we pay more for things today than we did in 1929. In all things being equal, you know, wages keep up with inflation, and it's not much of a problem. You know, what we're experiencing now, that's an exception. It's a little bit different. But we don't want the dollar to just suddenly start, or we don't want prices to fall so greatly that our buying power goes up sky high. And now for you and me, that sounds like a great thing, but there's a problem underneath that, and it affects the economy. So what that tends to be when you have that type of deflation is that nobody's buying anything, right? There's also no investment in businesses. There's no, you know, there's no capital being put into creating jobs. So at sudden, you know, sort of drop in prices for you and me sounds like a great thing, but that's meaning there's no demand for those items, and largely because of a loss of confidence, for one, in the stock market. There's lots of confidence in banking, so this starts to just snowball. And what happens then? People start pulling their money out of banks because they're worried about losing money. And then those banks fold up. So about 1/3 of the banks in the U.S. Shuttered their doors during the Great Depression because you know people taking their money out. There's not money to invest, and nobody is getting loans. So these banks are folding up. This happened recently in Greece. It was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. There was a big economic downturn, and Greece basically put a halt on how much money you could take out of the bank in a day. Like if you went to the ATM, and of course, you know, there's only so much you can take out of the ATM anyway, but I think people were limited to like $50 that you could take out a day because they were preventing a run on the banks. The Federal Reserve had started in the 1910s because of a brief economic panic and this kind of scenario. The Federal Reserve was supposed to help prevent that. But once things start snowballing and getting out of control, the Federal Reserve, there's only so much they could do. So yeah, there's lots of confidence in the banking world. So there's no borrowing of money. So that's just sort of the whole economy is imploding at that point. It's just caving in on itself. Also, pricing, talking about how that hurts people, right? The price of agricultural goods, of crops were falling. So farmers were being impacted by that deflation in prices, right? Their crops are not selling for as much as they used to be. So they're not making as much money. Another huge problem in agriculture was the Dust Bowl, which was a severe drought in those early 30s throughout the U.S. Midwest. And that picture that I have there on the slide is, from the Midwest. You could see that is just a dust storm All that is just dirt blowing around in the air. So the drought conditions were so bad, you couldn't grow any crops, and you were losing the nutrients from the soil because it was just blowing away. So a really hard time in the agricultural industry, which at this time was still really large, right? I've talked about, how we get these sort of agricultural revolutions every so often, and the amount of people that work on farms drops. Well, the next one doesn't come around for a while. So you still have, and particularly in certain regions of the US, so the Midwest, agriculture was still a huge industry and it employed a lot of people. So that is causing a huge issue. Another issue that people point to, which comes a little bit later, in 1930, is the SmootHill Tariff Act. And it's the idea was that the tariffs were going to protect U.S. exports and sort of bolster our foreign trade. The reality is, though, they were taxing, a tariff is when you tax goods coming into your country, basically. Simple definition there, imports. So they were trying to slow down the amount of imports and trying to bolster the amount of exports. Well, the rest of the world tends to react when you start putting tariffs on stuff. So they started reducing American imports, or American exports to other countries, and taxing them. So this added to that global nature because of the drop in global trade, in international trade. And it fell to, I think, less than half of what it had been at this time as well, adding to that economic or global crisis. So what we're experiencing now is, because this loss of confidence in banking, and there's no borrowing, there's no investment in new businesses, there's no investment in existing businesses to bring new products to people or increase productivity or anything like that. Obviously, there's going to be a lack of jobs. So we're seeing mass employment at its height. The Great Depression, what's unemployment today? I think it's less than 4%, right? 4% of able-bodied Americans searching for work are out of work, 4%. And that's pretty darn low. That's not a bad number. When we get too low, that actually causes some economic issues as well. At the height of the Great Depression, mass unemployment reached about 25%. So about a fourth of working age adults in the United States were out of work. So they're not earning money. They can't put money back into the economy. And you could see, so this lasted for 10 years. The effects of the Great Depression went on from 1929, and most historians say that we were out of it in 1939. There was still an impact. What largely lifted us completely out of the Great Depression was World War II for the United States. And as I mentioned, any developed country and really the whole world felt some impact, some effect of the global depression. And one of those countries that probably felt it the worst was Germany. Do you remember me talking about Germany yesterday and how they were blamed for World War I? And they were already had to pay these reparations for the war, things that they didn't pay until like the 1980s, and were basically embarrassed and demoralized. So on top of that, now here's 1929. We're about a decade past World War I, and this Great Depression smacks Germany right in the face. Now, in their case, inflation went through the roof. I mean, they were printing $1 million Deutschmarks. That's how bad inflation was. Because so you can imagine carrying around $1 million bill, right? That's literally what was going on there to pay for things. That's how outrageous prices were getting. It was called hyperinflation. I don't even know. Who do you think we'd put on the $1 million bill? that's going to come back and haunt the world as well. And we'll talk about that probably tomorrow when we get to the early stages of World War II. But go ahead here. I'll wrap up. We'll talk about this man, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Herbert Hoover had been the president at the beginning of the Great Depression. He was a Republican, and he did try some programs. He wasn't completely oblivious to what was happening, but as a Republican and a conservative, the idea tends to be less government is better. So a lot of his programs were designed to try to help businesses. And I think we looked at a political cartoon. One of the things that he did was trying to end speculation in the stock market. He tried to sort of bolster banking and some other things, but it was pretty shallow. And of course, when we get to these sort of, crises, whether it's war or, economics or anything, again, I mentioned we tend to blame the president, and that oftentimes will result in a new regime. So this is exactly what happens here. People looking for something new, some relief, somebody to help, and they turn to Franklin D. Roosevelt. So he is elected 32nd president, March 4th, 1933. Now, you might want to see how long he was president. From 1933 to April 12th, 1945, where he dies in office and was just elected for his 4th term. So had he lived through his term, he would have served as president for 16 years. And who knows, he may have went on and tried to get reelected again. That will be the last time in this country we will see a president that was elected for more than 2 terms. There had been an unspoken sort of tradition that you ran twice, and which was basically started with George Washington. He was elected president. They had a 4-year term, which they've always had, and then he was elected again. And at the end of that, he's like, you know what? I'm finished. This is good for me, and he left office. And ever since then, until Franklin Roosevelt, we had never had a president try to run more than twice. But because we were in this situation with these economic crisis and then World War II, people felt safe reelecting him. There is legislation during the next presidential administration to limit the terms of the president. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to civics. But after that, we will never, it was limited to 2 terms. And there's other sort of rules that apply there. But so Roosevelt was a Democrat. He was progressive. He had different ideas, and he believed government should be involved in helping the economy, which goes along with sort of the economic theory that he adopted. So as the Great Depression is happening, and before that, there's this dude in Great Britain. His name is John Maynard Keynes. He was an economic theorist. He was an economist, and he was looking at, what happened. And there was basically 2 views that came out of that are sort of the dominating still today of what happened during the Great Depression, what caused it, and how to fix it. So the one is the monetarist or the monetarist view, that it was a lack of money supply. And that's what caused the issue with banks. Won't get into that one too much. The Keynesian idea is that it was a lack of demand, largely. And in order to stabilize the economy, the government needs to step in. And if they need to run a deficit, right, they need to spend more than they're bringing in to help lift the economy up and stimulate the economy, bring demand back, and that will ensure that you know are just that sort of a cycle of economic policy and procedure. So once you get demand back, you get people buying things again, then that helps businesses. They have money and capital to reinvest in the economy, reinvest in their businesses, and you employ more people. And then you have more people with money who are buying more goods, right? And most people today in in government, even Republicans to some degree, are Keynesian, theorists, because we're in this sort of situation in the world with capitalism that if you're not growing, you're dying. So there's this expectation that you kind of have to keep growing to have a healthy economy. So that's why our Dow Jones Industrial Average is like 1,000 times more than what it was in, or 100 times more than it was in 1929. But this is the sort of idea that Franklin Roosevelt adopted, that you need to stimulate the economy. Now, you've probably heard that term here recently over the last, 2 or 3 years. When it came to COVID, we had an economic slowdown during that. They were trying to stimulate the economy. One such way was that a lot of people received stimulus checks, right? A lot of people, for some, a lot of people, that was more than a stimulus check. It was a parachute to keep them from, losing their apartment or putting food on the table. But the idea in a stimulus check is that you go out and you spend it, right? That's why it's a stimulus check and not a, put it in the bank and save it check. They want you to go out there and try to jumpstart the economy. So that was Roosevelt's idea. He needed to have his hands involved in the economy, getting things back on track. And to some degree, there's a lot of historians that will consider him a dictator, that he did a lot of things that were above and beyond the typical powers of the presidency. And remember, I told you, Abraham Lincoln was sort of the prototype for sort of the new American president, that they're much more involved. And FDR sort of continues that mold, particularly with the Democrat Party. And of course, there is pushback because there are others who believe that it goes too far. There's too much government intervention in business and in the private sector. But anyway, some of the highlights here as far as his plan. So the first New Deal, which was one of the very first things he did when he came to office between 1933 and 1934, he had a banking holiday to basically shut down banks, right? Just like when we have federal holidays today, typically banks are closed. A lot of certain businesses are closed. But that was trying to help the banks from continuing to slide, to give them a break, to give them a breather by closing the banks and letting making people, forcing them not to take their money out of the bank. Just slowing things down. Another thing he did with the first New Deal was the Public Works Administration, which was really popular. And if we look around our country, a lot of state parks improvements and road improvements and building, sort of government building came out of that. So with the Public Works Administration, it put a lot of people back to work. It gave them job training, and was one way, trying to help stimulate the economy by getting people some money in their pocket that they can go and then spend, and also, perhaps learn some type of job training that they could take on once they're finished with their public works jobs. There was a park that was close to my home growing up in West Virginia. It was Grandview. It's now a national park. It was a state park back then, but it was basically created from the Public Works Administration. They had dudes come in and create the roads and build the picnic areas and all of that. That's what they did. The second New Deal from 1935 1936, again, more programs and things, but one of the highlights and one of the things that a lot of us will be familiar with that came from the second New Deal was the Social Security Act. So you have FDR in 1935 to think that for that number that we all get assigned as American citizens or as immigrants, to get benefits and just basically how we're recognized in the world. That was not the intent at all when it was created. We really sort of overuse that number in today's world. But the Social Security Act and Social Security was basically just a supplement to people's retirement because, pensions were taking a hit, retirements, if you were retiring or if you had retired, you may have seen a loss of your pension, which was sort of the old school, 401k or retirement plan that we have today, or your savings. So to help people, live and, those that may have already retired, the Social Security check was a supplement to that, retirement, and you had a number assigned to you, and from that point forward, as you're born a natural citizen, you are immediately assigned a number. Now, Roosevelt ran into a lot of issues, though. There were certainly people in Congress, in the legislative branch, that pushed back on these programs and the things that he was attempting. The Supreme Court was one of the issues that he had, trying to get things passed, whether it was executive orders or through legislation. The Supreme Court shot down a lot of what he was doing, saying that it was unconstitutional. So there was about a year during his first term, still, I believe, that he attempted to pack the court. So packing the court is an idea that has been brought up here recently since Joe Biden was elected, of expanding the Supreme Court to probably 13 members. Right now, there's 9, Supreme Court justices. You have that odd number, so you don't constantly have gridlock, and you have 4 voting this way and 4 voting that way. And at different times throughout our history, you have a more progressive, sort of liberal-leaning court, and right now we have a much more conservative court, based on the members, and the number of members that fall that way. So in FDR's day, similar thing. You had a much more conservative court. Was worried that this ideas that he has and this involvement of the government and private business was not okay. So he had a lot of battles with them, and he attempted to put more members in the court. By expanding the court, then he could swing it the other way. And that's something that, has been either, depending on what side of the aisle, I guess, you fall on, either Joe Biden should expand the court to up the numbers and swing things back his way, or the fear that you're going to expand the court, which is beyond the powers of the president, and it may cause an issue. I'm of the mindset when it comes to certain things like that, okay, it might work for you today, but that could come and bite you later on. You might have you might have more liberal justices in 2022, but what's going to happen in maybe 2032? If you have some of those justices retire, you could still wind up with reversing and having more conservative justices. But anyway, so he spends about a year trying to expand the court, and nothing ever comes of that. And a lot of people criticize him for wasting time trying to get this passed, where you could get more Supreme Court justices to sway the decisions there. And then some of the other highlights here, of course, Roosevelt suffered from polio. He was in a wheelchair most of the time during his presidency. That fact was often hidden from the American people. He was never shown in his wheelchair. During World War II, when I was out in LA for a couple summers, I went aboard the USS Iowa, which was a big battleship. And this particular battleship had taken Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference during World War II, where the world leaders met. And they had to install a bathtub on the battleship for him, because he couldn't stand to shower. And of course, by the end of his life, that had all really taken a toll. So he passed away April 12th, 1945. And Harry Truman, who had been vice president for all of about 2 months, became president at that point. And then finally there, you see that the 22nd Amendment, which was passed in February 1951, then prevents a president from serving more than 2 terms. Also, if you serve, as in this case, is a good example. So FDR had only served like about a month or two of his presidency in that last term, and Harry Truman takes over. If you serve more than half of a former president's term, as vice president, you also can only be reelected 1 time, because you basically served, that entirety of somebody else's role. And again, that's amendments require 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So it was a fairly popular idea that maybe having a president elected 4 times might not be the best idea, even though that, depending on, your opinion, FDR is seen as either, someone that really hurt America or really was a savior and brought us out of a real economic crisis and led us through World War II. So that is where we will stop for today, because we'll start talking about the start of World War II tomorrow, and a lot of the issues surrounding that, some of the political ideas that led to that as well. But before we take a little break here and start language arts, any questions on the Great Depression, any other causes, what we did to get out of it? Okay, so just a couple things to remember that a huge economic downturn that lasted for about 10 years. FDR, once he was elected, about 4 years after the start of the Great Depression, 1933, did create a lot of public programs, got the government involved for really much more so than any time in its past in lifting the country out of this economic crisis, which also sort of changed the role of the president again. Anyway, so we'll leave off there. We'll take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back around 1:05, pretty early day today because my voice is going to blow out here in a minute. So around 1:05, we'll come back for language arts and deal with some figurative language. All right. All right, I'll see y'all there.